Hello students, welcome to our second module of class 8 history, our past tree, chapter 6 weavers, iron smelters and factory owners. In our previous module, we have discussed about the Indian textiles in the European market. In this module, we will discuss about the decline of Indian textile as well as about the iron and steel industry of India. So let us begin. The development of cotton industries in Britain affected textile producers in India in several ways. First, Indian textiles now had to compete with British textiles in the European and American market. Second, exporting textiles to England also became increasingly difficult since very high duties were imposed on Indian textiles imported into Britain. By the beginning of the 19th century, English-made cotton textiles successfully ousted Indian goods from the traditional markets in Africa and America. Thousands of weavers in India were now thrown out of employment. Bengal weavers were the worst hit. English and European companies stopped buying Indian goods and their agents no longer gave out advances to weavers to secure supplies. But wars were still to come. By the 1830s, British cotton cloth flooded Indian markets. In fact, by the 1880s, two-thirds of all the cotton clothes worn by Indians were made of cloth produced in Britain. This affected not only specialist weavers but also spinners. Thousands of rural women who made a living by spinning cotton trade were rendered jobless. However, handloom weaving did not completely die in India. This was because some types of clothes could not be supplied by machines. How could machines produce saris with intricate borders or clothes with traditional woven patterns? This had a wide demand not only amongst the rich but also amongst the middle classes. You must have heard of Jalalpur in western India and Madurai in South India. These towns emerged as important new centers of weaving in the late 19th century. Later, during the national movement, Mahatma Gandhi urged people to boycott imported textiles and use hand-spun and hand-woven cloth. Khadi gradually became a symbol of nationalism. Later on, several cotton mills came up in India in places like Bombay, Ahmedabad, Solapur, Nagpur and Kanpur. The first cotton mill in India was set up as a spinning mill in Bombay in the year 1854. Now let us talk about the Indian iron and steel. You must have heard about the famous sword of Tipu Sultan. The sword had an incredible hard and sharp edge that could easily rip through the opponent's armor. This quality of the sword came from a special type of high carbon steel called woods, which was produced all over South India. Wood steel, when made into swords, produced a very sharp edge with a flowing water pattern. This pattern came from very small carbon crystals embedded in the iron. Wood steel was produced in many hundreds of smelting furnaces in Mysore. In these furnaces, iron was mixed with charcoal and put inside small clay pots through an intricate control of temperatures. The smelters produced steel ingots that were used for sword making not just in India but in West and Central Asia too. Production of wood steel required a highly specialized technique of refining iron, but iron smelting in India was extremely common till the end of the 19th century. In Bihar and Central India in particular, every district had smelters that used local deposits of ore to produce iron, which was widely used for the manufacture of implements and tools of daily use. The furnaces were most often built of clay and sun-dried bricks. The smelting was done by men while women worked the bellows. The bellow is a device or equipment that can pump air. These bellows that were pumped kept the charcoal burning. However, by the late 19th century, the craft of iron smelting was in decline. In most villages, furnaces fell into disuse and the amount of iron produced came down. But can you tell me why was this so? Yes, one reason was the new forest laws that you have already read in chapter number 4, that is tribal discourse and the vision of a golden age. When the colonial government prevented people from entering the reserve forest, how could the iron smelters find wood for charcoal? Where could they get iron ore? Defying forest laws, they often entered the forest secretly and collected wood, but they could not sustain their occupation on this basis for long. Many gave up their craft and looked for other means of livelihood. In some areas, the government did grant access to the forest, but the iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for every furnace they used. This reduced their income. Moreover, by the late 19th century, iron and steel was being imported from Britain. Ironsmiths in India began using the imported iron to manufacture utensils and implements. This lowered the demand for iron produced by local smelters. Now let us talk about the iron and steel factories in India. The year was 1904. In the hot month of April, Charles Weld, an American geologist, and Dorabji Tata, the eldest son of Jamsetji Tata, were traveling in Chhattisgarh in search of iron ore deposits. They had spent many months on a costly venture looking for sources of good iron ore to set up a modern iron and steel plant in India. Jamsetji Tata had decided to spend a large part of his fortune to build a big iron and steel industry in India. But this could not be done without identifying the source of fine quality iron ore. One day, after traveling for many hours in the forest, Weld and Dorabji came upon a small village and found a group of men and women carrying basket loads of iron ore. These people were the Agarias. When asked where they had found the iron ore, the Agarias pointed to a hill in the distance. Weld and Dorabji reached the hill after an exhausting trek through dense forest. On exploring the hill, the geologists declared that they had at last found what they had been looking for. The Rajhara Hills had one of the finest ores in the world. But there was a problem. The region was dry and water necessary for running the factory was not to be found nearby. The Tatas had to continue their search for a more suitable place to set up their factory. A few years later, a large area of forest was cleared on the banks of the river Subarnarekha to set up the factory and industrial township which we now know as Jamsetpur. Here, there was water near iron ore deposits. The Tata Iron and Steel Company, that is TISCO, was set up here and it began producing steel in 1912. TISCO was set up at an opportune time. All through the late 19th century, India was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain. Expansion of the railways in India had provided a huge market for rails that Britain produced. For a long while, British experts in the Indian railways were unwilling to believe that good quality steel could be produced in India. By the time TISCO was set up, the situation was changing. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Steel produced in Britain now had to meet the demands of war in Europe. So imports of British steel into India declined dramatically and the Indian railways turned to TISCO for supply of rails. As the war dragged on for several years, TISCO had to produce cells and carriage wheels for the war. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by TISCO. Over time, TISCO became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. So this brings us to the end of the chapter, that is weavers, iron smelters and factory owners. Let us summarize what we have learned. The development of cotton industries in Britain affected textile producers in India. A high carbon steel called woods was produced all over South India. TISCO began producing steel in 1912. Let us see what you have grasped today. Here are some questions for you. Your question number 1 is, the first cotton mill in Bombay was set up in the year dash, and the options are A. 1820, B. 1830, C. 1840, or D. 1854, and the correct answer is D. 1854. Your second question is, the process of deriving metal from rock is known as, and the options are A. Orang, B. Smelting, C. Dyeing, or D. Bellows, and the correct answer is B. Smelting. Your third question is, the First World War began in the year dash, and the options are A. 1912, B. 1913, C. 1914, or D. 1919, and the correct answer is C. 1914. It's practice time now, and here is some homework for you. Your question number 1 is, who are the Agarias? Your question number 2 is, how did the development of cotton industries affect textile producers in India? And the question number 3 is, why did the Indian iron smelting industry decline in the 19th century? In our next module, we will move to History, Chapter 7, Civilizing the Native, Educating the Nation. Till then, take care of yourself, stay home, stay safe. Thank you.